The wind after the fire moved like breath through ribs. Black pine spires, soil baked to glass, and at the lip of a burned slope, a round slab of buckled metal peered from the ash. I brushed away soot with the back of my glove and found a hair-thin strand of blue nylon snagged in the roots, the color stubborn as a bruise. 10 feet upslope, the old pine still carried the Roman numerals charred but legible. Ein. The camera we recovered nearby looked melted into itself, but the little card inside was dry as bone. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I used to measure summers by the sound of the ice machine in the station kitchen and the way the resin on the pines grew sweet when the thermometer nudged past 80. Mornings began with dust on my boots and a pencil behind my ear. By noon, the trailhead porch smelled like sun-warmed canvas and coffee that had been on the burner too long. That July, the forest felt settled the way a well-lived house does. Screen doors that knew their hinges, footpaths that remembered every heel that ever pressed them. Mariposa County runs on routines. We set our watches to the noon siren and the evening freight. We leave porch lights on low and park by backing in because the road out of a canyon can ask for speed you didn't plan on. In town, you still see folks count change into their palms and fold it into wallets that have carried the same driver's license for 20 years. Up on the ridge, our rituals were simpler. Clear a blowdown, walk the line, check the register, return with the same number of hikers you sent out. On the Saturday they came through, I'd been oiling the latch on the East Bay door. Tess was inside, perched at the desk with the ledger open and a fan pushing warm air across her knuckles. Mid-July meant steady traffic families with foam coolers, college kids in sandals, old-timers who called every turn by a name the new maps forgot. The window glass was sun-soft, and the smell of pine pitch crept through the screens. They arrived near breakfast, Anna, first Mark, just behind with an extra canteen bumping the side of his pack. She had a camera strap cutting a line across one shoulder and freckles the sun had already found. He was all careful edges. He set his pack down as if the porch rail could bruise. The two of them felt like people who planned holidays more than parties. The kind who tape lists to refrigerator doors and actually cross things off. Trail 4 to the North Loop, Mark said, pointing. Back by Monday. He had that clean, quiet way of speaking you hear in engineers and small-town pastors. I told him about the heat building afternoon and the way the creek ran low, more rock than water. I held the map so the glare didn't blind them. He studied the contours like they were a set of instructions, and I could see how his mind walked ahead of him laying down steps. Anna smiled without rushing it. She asked how far the ridge views were miles by boot minutes if you were a hawk, and if bears liked the blueberry flats. She teased the camera out of its case, as if it had its own heartbeat. "I'll stay on the trail," she said. "I just want the light off those boulders before it gets harsh." She didn't look past me into the office. She looked through me into the trees the way people do when a place has already taken hold. Tess slid the ledger through the window. "Names, please," she said the way she always did, never as a formality. Mark signed neat and square. Anna wrote in loops, the pen tip making a little halo in the paper where she pressed too hard at the end. He added a phone number. She drew a small sun. I stamped the date the way my hands had done 1,000 times. There's a sound to boots meeting stairs when people are headed toward a trail they trust, light, elastic, almost musical. They had that sound. I stepped out and watched them walk the first 100 feet just enough to be sure the shoulders of their packs sat right and the straps weren't slicing circulation. Plenty of hikers refuse advice. These two didn't. At the trail sign, Mark turned back and raised a hand. Anna took a picture of Tess through the glass. The shutter's click was like a small truth finding its place. By late morning, heat stood in the bottoms, and the air over the firs wobbled in that summer shimmer you can see if you squint. I checked the radio, checked the weather tickers, wrote down a note about thunderheads building east of Chiquito Ridge. The day stretched long as it always did, out-of-county plates rattling into the lot, a paper sack of ice sweating on the porch, a knot of teenagers arguing over which loop would look best on a postcard. A father asked me if the distances on the sign were in miles or kilometers, and I told him this was still California, not Mars. He laughed and folded his trail brochure into his pocket like he might save it for his kids. Around 2, I walked the first mile out and back, a habit I kept on busy weekends. The dust lay soft as flour, new tracks stitched into it. A coyote had crossed light prints with a pause at the culvert to sniff the shadow, under the old pine that everybody called the tree, long before we remembered why a length of pink ribbon had fallen across a root. I picked it up and tied it to a low branch so it wouldn't blow into the creek. Folks used to leave ribbons to mark the turn. The newer maps had done away with that custom, but the forest keeps fingerprints long past the papers say so. When I returned, Tess had 3 hikers waiting with questions. I filled a bottle, took a note about a loose plank on the footbridge, then sat at the desk to log the noon pass-throughs. Working the register felt like balancing a checkbook for trees, each entry a little contract with the day. I drew a straight line with my ruler, wrote the time, marked the weather. At the bottom of the page, where the grain of the paper lifted slightly, I noticed a small burr in the corner, like something had snagged. Nothing more. Evenings at the station slow to a pocket watch's pace. Shadows deepen under the eaves and the lot empties except for the late campers and the ones who drive in just to sit quiet and watch the ridge blush. I made a round at 6 and again at 8. Tess tucked her hair into a cap and stepped out to breathe the cooler air without the fan's hum. Far up the slope the light went soft and gold. If you were a painter, you'd have thrown away your brush. Just before sunset, a family rolled in, dusty and happy, their minivan coughing like it had swallowed a field. The kids ran ahead to throw pebbles into the ditch. The mother asked if we'd seen a lost lens cap. I told her I'd keep an eye out and asked where they'd been. Trail 4, she said, the ridge where the big pine is. She described the tree in detail, the old scar in the bark, the twist in the crown, how the trunk leaned just enough to look like a shoulder taking weight. She said it like she'd met a person instead of wood, which is how some trees strike people. It felt older than the others, she said, like it knew things. I said the forest keeps more stories than the library. We're just lousy at listening. Night pulled the color from things. At 9, Tess closed the ledger and locked the drawer with that small ceremony of keys that always made her smile. "See you in the morning," she said, flipping the porch light on. We kept it low, a little amber bowl against the dark. I swept the grit off the steps, coiled the hose, and watched a moth throw itself in circles until it found the edge of night again. At home, the cabin air held the day's heat like a memory. I propped the back door, let the cooler draw from the creek slide across the floor, and poured tea over ice that cracked in the glass with a sound that belongs to summer. My radio sat on the counter where it always lived. I kept it near even off-duty. Old habit. A ranger learns to listen in his bones. The first frog called about 10. A freight load beyond the ridge. I read a chapter of a book I can't recall now, dog-eared the page, and stood at the sink to rinse my glass. In the window, my porch light held steady yellow as a buttercup. A pair of headlights should have rolled past about that hour, late stragglers who'd promised their mothers a phone call from the payphone by the ranger board. I leaned against the threshold and waited the way you do when you're not waiting, just noticing. Down the road, the dark kept its shape. The radio stayed quiet. In the ledger at the station, a little sun next to 2 names waited for a hand to circle it and write, "Returned." Tess would do that in the morning, the same way she always did. I turned the porch light a notch brighter and left it burning longer than usual, the bulb humming softly like a throat clearing before a word that couldn't quite find its way out. By Sunday morning, the ridge wore a kind of hush that doesn't usually show up till fall. I opened the ranger station alone. Tess had taken the morning to drive into town for supplies, leaving me with the ledger, the radio, and a fresh pot of coffee that smelled like burnt bark. The porch was slick with dew, and the light through the trees came soft and gray the way it does before the heat sets in. I flipped through the logbook out of habit, scanning the entries from the day before. I saw their names again. Anna Porter and Mark Ellison written neat and steady, the little sun still bright in the paper. It should have felt ordinary, but something about the empty space below it stopped my hand for a moment. The next line, where the following hikers should have signed, was torn slightly at the edge. I remember running my thumb along that rough corner and thinking about how small things like a torn piece of paper can whisper louder than they ought to. By midday, the air had thickened. That mountain heat always carried a shimmer, and you could smell the resin lifting from the pines. 2 hikers came through, said they'd made the lower loop by Tree 9, but turned back early because of a strange echo down in the ravine. Could have been a deer, one of them said, rubbing the sweat off his neck. But it didn't sound right. Too slow. I noted it the way you do when something sits crooked in your head. They hadn't seen anyone else on the ridge. I told myself Anna and Mark were probably up by the North Bluff taking photos the way couples do when they've got more weekend than time to fill it. That evening the wind shifted. The temperature dropped almost 10 degrees and the crickets started earlier than usual. I stood outside with the radio at my hip, scanning for chatter. Nothing. Tess came back just before dark, her hands full of grocery bags and her voice light like the world still turned the same. We were locking up when I noticed the porch light flickering. "Bulb's on its last leg," I said. She laughed, reached up to twist it tighter. For some reason I remember the shape of her arm in that light, pale against the gold glow. It was the last easy thing we did for a long time. By Monday morning, the coffee was cold before I could finish it. No check-in from Anna and Mark. Normally, we'd give a party 12 hours past their expected return before we worried, but something about the silence hung wrong. I radioed the lower outpost, no sightings. Tess checked the register again, then frowned. "Their page is gone," she said. I walked over, looked for myself. She wasn't wrong. The page with their names had been torn clean from the binding. The perforation line was still visible, fresh, not weathered. We both stood there quiet, like maybe it would make sense if we didn't move. I tried to reason it out. Sometimes kids took pages for souvenirs, or folks tore them accidentally when the humidity swelled the book. But this wasn't that kind of tear. It was deliberate, smooth, and too clean. Tess looked at me over the edge of the desk. "You think they came back early?" she asked. "Maybe." It was a lie I didn't even try to sell well. She called the ranger substation to log it anyway, and I drove out toward Ridge Hollow to make a visual check. The trailhead was empty, as expected. Their car, a silver Honda, still sat in the dirt lot, a film of dust and pine needles clinging to the windshield. The inside looked untouched, a pair of water bottles, a folded park map, and a half-eaten granola bar wrapped neatly in foil. I cupped my hands against the glass. No keys, no gear. The seats were clean. It looked like 2 people had parked for a short walk, not an overnight trip. I noted the license plate, then stepped into the tree line. Walking that trail alone always had a rhythm. Every 40 paces, the slope changed just enough to pull at your calves. The air was still heavy with sap. Around the first bend, I found a ribbon, bright pink, the kind hikers used years back for marking loops tied to a branch. I'd retied one there the day before, but this wasn't mine. It was newer, tighter, like someone had wanted to make sure it wouldn't blow loose. I took it down and slid it into my pocket. The soil beneath it was scuffed 2 sets of boot prints pressed deep from recent rain, both heading north. Beyond that, smaller prints joined faint maybe from a few days prior. I crouched low, tracing one with my finger. Could have been animal, could have been human. Hard to tell. About 2 miles in, I reached the clearing where the old pine stood. Tree 9. The air there always carried a kind of coolness, even in heat, like shade that remembers snow. The trunk leaned a few degrees east, scarred with the Roman numerals that had long since filled with resin. I ran my hand over the grooves, felt the age in it. A few feet away, the underbrush was pressed down oval-shaped, like someone had set a pack there for a while. I spotted a half-buried tin can, rusted and empty, maybe from another camper years ago. But near it in the dirt was something newer, a torn strap, blue nylon, maybe from a rain jacket or gear bag. The fabric still smelled faintly synthetic, like melted plastic and soil. I remember saying to myself, "That's too new for this place." I folded it, slipped it into my vest pocket, and kept walking a little farther up the slope. By late afternoon, the light through the trees had turned thin and golden. I reached the bluff line where the trail narrowed. From there, you can see the valley stretch for miles, sage and shadow ridges stacked like folded fabric. Beautiful, but silent. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting to hear something voices movement, anything human. All I got was the slow creak of branches and the distant echo of a hawk. When I got back to the station, Tess was on the radio with dispatch. "No call-ins, no checkouts," she said, handing me the receiver. I gave my report, kept it brief, mentioned the missing page and the car still at the lot. The deputy on duty asked if we wanted to file an overdue hiker notice yet. "Let's give it until morning," I said, though my gut was already shifting. Tess nodded, didn't argue. She locked the ledger drawer again and laid the key flat on the desk like setting down a coin you didn't want to spend. That night, the air turned strange, still too quiet for summer. The wind usually moves through that forest like slow breath, but the leaves didn't move at all. Even the insects held back. I sat on my porch after dark, staring at the ridgeline. From my angle, I could just see the glow of the ranger station's porch light, small and amber against the black slope. I remember thinking how that light always meant safety, that as long as it burned, someone knew the way home. But that night, it looked different. Smaller. Fragile. The next morning, Tess arrived early. She had her hair still damp from the shower, and a look that told me she hadn't slept. No word she said before I even asked. We drove up together this time. The car was still there, same position, same dust. I opened the driver's side door. It wasn't locked. The keys sat on the floor mat beneath the seat. That detail stuck in me like a splinter. Hikers don't drop keys under the seat. They clip them, tuck them in zippers, tape them to the visor. They don't forget them there. I bagged them in plastic, called it in. Tess circled the lot, checking for fresh tire tracks. None. We started the hike again, slower this time, eyes on the ground. The sun broke through thin clouds, and the smell of warm soil carried that sharp sweetness that always reminds me of August. A mile in, Tess stopped. "Look at this," she said, pointing at a footprint half hidden by pine needles. It was smaller than mine, narrower like a woman's hiking boot, facing north. A few feet beside it, another print, heavier tread, maybe a man's, facing the same direction. Normal enough, except for one more set between them, shorter, lighter, too small to match either of the pair we were tracking. We followed that set another 50 yards before they vanished at a bend. When we reached Tree 9 again, I told Tess to stay back and take photos while I walked the perimeter. That clearing felt colder now, like a cellar just opened. I noticed something I hadn't before. The carved numerals looked darker, filled not just with resin but soot, as if someone had burned them to make them last. Near the base, someone had scraped the soil clean and drawn a shape, a circle with lines radiating outward. Could have been random, could have meant something. I took a photo anyway. By late afternoon, Sheriff Bauer met us on site. She'd been a rookie when I first worked with her, back when her badge still shone like a new penny. She crouched beside the carving-gloved hands, brushing dirt away. "Could be nothing," she said softly. I nodded. "Could be." She looked at the torn strap in my pocket and asked to see it. "This from them?" she asked. "Don't know yet." She slipped it into an evidence bag, sealed it with tape. "We'll find out." On the way back down, the wind returned. It came sudden and low, carrying the smell of rain that never arrived. Halfway to the lot, I turned and looked over my shoulder. The ridge was already swallowing the light. Every tree leaned into shadow like it knew something it wouldn't say. We reached the truck headlights cutting through dust, and for a second, I thought I saw movement on the far edge of the trail, a flicker of blue between the trees. Then nothing. Tess saw it too, though neither of us said a word. That night, the porch light at the station burned steady again. We left it on, same as always. I logged the day, filled the blanks in the report, wrote their names carefully on the incident line. The ink bled slightly into the paper fibers the way moisture creeps into old wood. When I closed the book, the silence in that room felt larger than the walls. Outside, a coyote called once and then went quiet. I remember glancing toward the ridge, waiting for the echo, but it never came. Just the hum of the bulb overhead and the faint hiss of the radio static, like the forest itself trying to decide whether to speak. The morning we filed the overdue report, the fog was thick enough to hide the ridge entirely. You could smell the damp pine needles and wet ash, the kind of scent that tells you the air's holding on to last night's rain. I remember sitting in the truck with the defroster on, watching beads of condensation slide down the windshield, while Sheriff Bauer filled her coffee thermos. She looked different from the young deputy I'd trained years back, quieter around the eyes, steadier in the way she carried her silence. We didn't talk much on the drive up. Neither of us needed to. There's a rhythm to missing person calls in the mountains. You hope for a simple wrong turn, maybe a sprained ankle, but you prepare for something else. By the time we reached the trailhead, the fog had started to lift, and the world came back in slow shapes. The empty car, the quiet lot, a scrap of blue sky struggling through the trees. Search protocol is simple. You start where the person was last seen, then fan out in sections. We had 8 volunteers that morning, mostly off-duty rangers and a few locals who knew the terrain better than any GPS could. Tess brought out laminated maps marking zones with a red grease pencil. I took the north loop. Sheriff Bauer stayed near the base coordinating the comms. Before we split, she caught my arm and said, "Stay in line of sight. This place swallows people." I told her I knew that already. By mid-morning, the sun burned through the fog and the air turned sharp with humidity. Every footstep made a soft crunch on the damp soil. About a mile in, I noticed the ground had changed, less pine litter, more exposed earth, as if something heavy had pressed through recently. I called it in, marked it with an orange flag, and kept moving uphill. The forest there has a strange way of muting sound. Even your own breathing feels distant. I could hear the faint chatter of the other team somewhere to my left. Then, nothing but the slow drip of water off the needles. Near a cluster of boulders, I found what looked like the remains of a campsite, flattened grass, a ring of stones, a char mark faintly visible in the dirt. Not fresh, but not ancient either. I crouched low, brushing my hand across the soil. It was cold, but when I pressed deeper, it was dry underneath, meaning it hadn't been touched by last night's rain. Maybe 2 days old. I scanned the area. No trash, no utensils, nothing that would belong to casual hikers, just precision, deliberate absence. Tess radioed in around noon she'd found fabric snagged on a bush near the ridge. Blue nylon, she said, her voice crackling through static. I told her to mark it and stay put. When I reached her, the sun was directly overhead and the wind was barely moving. The fabric was identical to the piece I'd found earlier, torn clean along the seam, like it had been ripped off under strain. Could be from a jacket, she said, or a tent. I answered, though I knew better. We photographed it, bagged it, and noted the coordinates. The breeze carried that faint metallic tang you get when heat mixes with minerals like the air inside a machine that hasn't run in years. Later that afternoon, we regrouped at the clearing with the carved pine. The volunteers were sitting on logs drinking water, their faces streaked with sweat and pollen. Sheriff Bauer stood at the center, notebook in hand. No sign of fresh prints, she said. No litter, no scent for the dogs. One of the handlers, a wiry man named Porter, knelt beside his bloodhound and frowned. She picked something up earlier, he said, but it stops right here. Dead ends at the tree. He looked up at me, like they just evaporated. That night, back at the station, I studied the map under the fluorescent light. The lines and markers blurred together. After a while, the forest reduced to ink and contour. But I couldn't shake the shape of that clearing from my mind, the way the air felt colder near the tree, how even the insects seemed to avoid it. Tess sat across from me, eating a sandwich she wasn't tasting. "You ever notice," she said quietly, "how every time someone goes missing, it's like the forest rearranges itself? Trails change. Landmarks vanish." I nodded. The woods keep their own memory. She gave a small, tired smile. Then maybe they'll give it back. 2 days later, the county sent in a full search team with drones and thermal imaging. I'd seen plenty of searches in my time, but there was something different about this one. The equipment hummed and blinked, but the forest stayed still as if it was watching us back. Around noon, one of the drone operators called over the radio he'd spotted a depression in the hillside about a quarter-mile north of the main loop. We hiked out there, boots crunching over loose stone and ash. The depression wasn't natural. It was circular, about 6 feet across, edges blackened like old fire damage. At the center, metal glinted through the dirt. Sheriff Bauer knelt and brushed away soil until the outline of a rusted hatch came into view. No handles, no hinges visible. Just a narrow slit across the surface and a faint engraving, maybe a number, maybe a symbol. We taped off the area, logged the coordinates, and called it in to the county office. While we waited, I noticed something else, a tree about 10 feet upslope, half charred but still standing. Carved deep into the bark were the same Roman numerals we'd seen before. Ike's, Tree 9. The realization settled heavy in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence. I looked over at the sheriff. She was staring at the hatch, her jaw tight. "You ever seen anything like this?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not once. And I've seen a lot." When the forensic team arrived, they brought portable lights and pry bars. The metal was too thick to cut through easily, so they decided to open it the next morning with proper equipment. We left a guard overnight, Deputy Clay, a quiet man who'd spent 15 years in the service before joining the department. He volunteered to stay. Around midnight, the radio crackled once, a burst of static, then silence. When we came back at dawn, Clay was standing where we'd left him, pale and bleary-eyed. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Heard noises," he said. "Thought it was wind at first, but it wasn't." "Voices?" Tess asked. He hesitated. "Like metal moving. Something underneath." By mid-morning, the hatch was pried open. The smell hit first damp, metallic old rot mixed with earth. A narrow stairway led down into darkness. The air coming out was cold, colder than it should have been. Sheriff Bauer went down, first flashlight cutting through the black. I followed the steps, groaning under our weight. The chamber below was small concrete walls slick with condensation. In one corner, a sleeping bag lay half buried in ash and soil. Near it, a small stack of notebooks, edges burned and curled. No furniture, no sign of life. Just the feeling of something that had been sealed away too long. We marked every detail, every inch before moving toward the far wall. That's where I saw it, a thin bone jutting from the dirt, pale against the gray concrete. The sheriff froze. "That's human," she whispered. We called in the coroner immediately. When they unearthed it, they found more beneath partial remains tangled with fabric that matched the blue nylon we'd found earlier. Tess covered her mouth, turned away. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the soil like it might give back what it took. The evidence technicians worked in silence. Every scrape of a trowel sounded too loud. In the middle of it all, one of them found a small black box melted along one side. "Camera," he said, turning it in his gloved hand. The plastic casing was warped, but the memory card inside looked intact. Sheriff Bauer took it carefully, slid it into an evidence bag. She didn't say anything, but I could see the same thought running through her head that was running through mine. Whoever built this place had been watching. That night, none of us slept much. The lab in Fresno confirmed they could extract images from the card, so Bauer and I drove down together. The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. The technician loaded the card, the screen flickered, and the first few photos appeared. Deer, squirrels, a few hikers from years back. Then suddenly a frame that made my stomach drop, two figures hand in hand standing at the carved tree, Anna and Mark. Behind them, just at the edge of the frame, a shadowed outline, human-shaped, motionless. The next photo, they were gone. Just the tree, the same angle as if whoever held the camera hadn't moved at all. We sat there in the hum of the computer fan, no one speaking. Finally, the technician scrolled to the last image. It was the same clearing, same tree, but darker now, taken at night. A single red light glowed near the base of the trunk. I realized what it was. The blinking LED of another camera, still recording, still pointed toward the place where they vanished. Back at the station, the forest outside looked different, sharper around the edges. The air felt thinner. Sheriff Bauer leaned against her truck, rubbing her temples. "If that hatch was sealed, who closed it?" she asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. She looked out toward the ridge, the smoke from her breath rising in the cooling air. "We're not done with that place," she said. As I drove home that night, the road curved along the mountain like a thread pulled too tight. The trees were black silhouettes against a silver sky. In my rearview mirror, the ridge disappeared behind fog again, swallowing the lights one by one. For a long while, I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine, to the faint whistle of air through the vents, to the thought I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. If the forest keeps its own memory, then somewhere out there, it was still watching. I stayed late at the station that night, the photos still open on my desk. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the room, and the air smelled faintly of dust and the bitter edge of stale coffee. Outside, the forest lay dark and indifferent. Every case I'd ever worked had moments where the noise fades and you feel the weight of what's missing. But this was different. That image on the screen, the one of Anna and Mark standing under the carved tree, had burned itself into the back of my eyes. The longer I stared, the more that shadow behind them seemed less like a trick of light and more like intent, a presence. Sheriff Bauer had gone home hours earlier, told me to get some rest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I closed the computer, I might miss something. Something the forest was trying to show us in its own strange, quiet way. Around midnight, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the stars dulled by haze from the wildfires farther north. I could hear the hum of insects and the distant rush of water from the creek below the station. I remember thinking about the hatch, how cold that air had been when we pried it open like the earth had been holding its breath for 29 years. Part of me wanted to believe what we found down there was just a tragic end to a bad accident. The human mind clings to ordinary explanations when it can. But ordinary didn't fit this place. Not with a sealed door, scorched notebooks, and bones buried under concrete. By dawn, I was back in the field. We brought in the FBI's evidence recovery team, half a dozen specialists with ground-penetrating radar and a van full of equipment. They worked quietly, marking grids and setting up floodlights around the clearing. I stood beside Sheriff Bauer while they briefed us. "We're treating this as both a recovery and an active scene," the lead tech said. "Preliminary scan shows void spaces beneath the hatch, possibly connected chambers." The sheriff nodded, eyes fixed on the black opening. "We take it slow," she said. "We document every inch." The air down there hadn't changed. Cold, heavy, metallic. Our boots echoed on the concrete steps as we descended. The lights they'd rigged cast long, trembling shadows along the walls. I went last, carrying a small generator pack. When I reached the bottom, the others had already set up a perimeter. The room looked different in full light, smaller somehow, but alive with detail I hadn't noticed before. There were faint marks on the wall tallies, scratched deep into the concrete, too deliberate to be random. Tess counted them under her breath. Over 600. She looked up at me. That's almost 2 years. The technicians moved carefully, brushing away soot with soft paintbrushes, uncovering fragments that told stories none of us wanted to hear. A broken spoon, a small square of cloth that might have been part of a shirt. In the corner, the remains of a lantern, the glass long since blackened. One of the techs found a piece of paper pressed flat between two boards. It was too burned to read except for one phrase that stood out in heavy block letters, Session 2. I felt something shift in the room after that, like the air itself recoiled. Sheriff Bauer took the fragment in her glove, held it up to the light, then lowered it without saying a word. "Bag it," she said quietly. "Everything." When we climbed back to the surface, the sun had dropped low behind the ridge, throwing the valley into long strips of gold and gray. The forest looked calm again, but that calm had edges now. I stood beside the sheriff as the techs sealed off the site with tape. "You think this place has anything to do with the other disappearances?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She was staring toward the tree line, squinting against the fading light. "You know what bothers me," she said finally. "The precision. Whoever built this didn't do it in secret. They had funding planning design. This wasn't a trap made by some drifter. It's infrastructure." She turned toward me. "That's government money or private research. Either way, somebody signed off on it." That night, I couldn't bring myself to drive home. I slept in my truck by the edge of the lot, windows cracked, the radio tuned low to static, just to have something human in the background. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft measured. I sat up fast, flashlight in hand, but the lot was empty. The sound had come from the direction of the trailhead. I got out, sweeping the light through the trees. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something pale against the dark there, and gone again. I called out, waited, heard nothing but the creak. The next morning, when I checked the dirt near the signpost, there were footprints, small, barefoot, leading toward the forest. The following day, we received the lab report from Fresno. The remains from the bunker were confirmed as human 2 individuals, 1 male, 1 female, both matching the timeline of the 1995 disappearance. Cause of death undetermined, though trauma to the skull was noted. That should have closed the case, but it didn't. Not really, because of what else they found. In the melted trail camera, they recovered not just images but data logs, hundreds of time-stamped entries, stretching years beyond 1995. The last record was dated 2003. I remember sitting in the sheriff's office as she read through the report, her pen tapping the desk in an unsteady rhythm. "That can't be right," she said. The hatch was sealed. The technician on the call replied calmly, "Ma'am, the timestamps are verified. Whatever this system was, it stayed powered for at least 8 years after that couple disappeared." I watched her lean back in her chair, the color draining from her face. "So who kept it running?" she asked. Later that afternoon, we went through the photographs recovered from the bunker's secondary chamber. Most were damaged beyond recognition, just gray smudges and flares of light. But a few survived clear enough to make sense of. Faces. Not just Anna and Mark's. There were others, children, teenagers, people of different ages, all standing against the same concrete wall, their eyes fixed on the camera, their posture identical. Hands clasped in front, some smiling, faintly, most blank. In one image taken on a different camera, the wall behind them bore new markings, words etched deep, nearly gouged, "Exit denied." When the sheriff called the bureau again, her voice had lost its steadiness. "We need to know what this place was," she said. "Who built it? Who ran it?" The agent on the other end, a woman named Kellerman, promised to send over declassified documents by the next morning. Off the record, she added, "We've seen something like this before. Behavioral containment projects. Unofficial. Disavowed decades ago." I caught the sheriff's eye. "Containment," I said quietly. "You mean experiments?" The line went dead before she could answer. That evening, the wind picked up over the ridge, bringing with it the smell of burnt pine from the fires up north. The trees groaned against one another, and somewhere in the distance an owl called once, then again. I stood outside the station, watching the light flicker behind the blinds of the evidence room. Tess came out and joined me. She looked pale, tired, the way people look when they start to believe the ground beneath them isn't solid anymore. "You think it's over?" she asked. I wanted to say yes, but the truth hung heavier than the air. "No," I said. "Places like that don't close by themselves." Around midnight, the sheriff called. Her voice was hushed, strained. "Tom, I need you at the site." I didn't ask why. When I got there, the tape had been ripped down, flapping in the wind. The hatch was open again. The generator lights we'd left inside were off. At the edge of the clearing, fresh footprints, bare, small, leading away toward the slope. The sheriff crouched by them, flashlight trembling slightly. "Child's size," she murmured. I followed the prints with my beam until they vanished into the brush. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The forest was alive with sound again. Wind insects, the faint crackle of branches. But underneath it all, there was something else. A hum, low and constant, like machinery still running deep below the soil. We sealed the hatch again at dawn, bolted it with steel and concrete plugs. The Bureau sent a crew later that week to fence off the area, but I knew fences don't hold what wants to move underground. The official statement would call it a closed case. 2 hikers' tragic death site condemned for safety. But in my notebook, I wrote the truth as I saw it. They didn't die alone, and whatever watched them didn't stop when they were gone. A month later, after the last of the fire crews cleared the ridge, I went back once more, just to see. The clearing had regrown, faintly saplings pushing through ash ferns curling around the blackened base of Tree 9. The carving was still there, though shallower, now the numerals softened by time. I stood for a while, listening to the wind comb through the branches. Then I noticed something etched just below the original mark, fresh enough that bark dust still clung around it. 3 words, small and uneven but clear. "Session continues here." The forest went still again, and I felt it not fear exactly, but recognition. Like a name you've tried to forget, whispered back to you after too many years. I stepped back, the earth soft under my boots, and for a long moment I thought I heard breathing. Not mine. Not the wind. Something slow, patient, buried deep, waiting for someone to listen. The first frost came early that year. By mid-October, the ridge had lost most of its color, and the air above the forest carried that thin metallic bite that reminds you how short daylight really is in the mountains. I drove up there one last time under the pretense of closing the trail for the season, but that wasn't the truth. I needed to see it again before winter sealed it over. The Bureau's fencing crew had long since left. The warning signs were new bright yellow nailed to trees like exclamation points that didn't belong. Hazard area, do not enter. The ground was quiet, blanketed in pine needles. I parked by the old ranger sign, cut the engine, and let the silence take shape around me. It's strange how the forest remembers. The dirt lot looked almost the same as it had that first week, the same slant of sunlight across the slope, the same steady hum of the creek down below. But if you stood still long enough, you could feel the difference. The air was thicker, quieter, as if sound itself had learned to move more carefully. I stepped out my boots, crunching through frost, and started up the trail with my flashlight in hand. The cold hit the inside of my lungs like glass. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I'd carried the keys since before any of this began, and I wasn't ready to let it end on someone else's paperwork. The walk to the clearing took less than an hour. Every landmark looked familiar, but each one wrong in small, unsettling ways. A split boulder that used to lean north now angled south. A stream bed that had always been dry now shimmered faintly, catching light from nowhere. I kept to the trail, counting steps like I'd done 100 times before, and when I reached the rise where the pine stood. Tree 9, it felt like stepping into a photograph of a place that no longer existed. The trunk was darker now, its base buried in ash and new growth, but the carving was still there. The Roman numerals had softened with time, yet the bark around them seemed to swell inward as though the tree itself had tried to heal, but couldn't. And just beneath the old marks, etched fresh into the surface, were those words I'd found last time. Session continues here. The hatch lay about 20 feet away, hidden under a thin layer of soil and leaves. The Bureau had sealed it with a concrete plate, and welded steel poured new earth over top and logged the coordinates as decommissioned site. I brushed away the leaves anyway, tracing the seam with my gloved hand. Cold bled up from the ground sharper than the morning air. I told myself it was the frost, that the metal below was still holding winter, but part of me knew better. I stood there for a long time just listening. Nothing but the faint rustle of wind through branches. Then from somewhere deep below, a sound, soft, steady, mechanical. A hum. I stepped back fast, flashlight trembling in my hand. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, long enough to convince me I hadn't imagined it. Then it faded. When I returned to my truck, the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the shadows stretched long across the lot. A figure stood near the far edge, half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer. Then it moved, slow, deliberate human. "Hello." My voice sounded too loud against the quiet. The shape didn't answer, just shifted, slightly pale face, catching the light. A young girl, barefoot, hair tangled and light against her shoulders. She stared at me without fear, eyes glassy and unfocused. "You shouldn't be here," I said, stepping forward. She turned and slipped into the woods, silent as smoke. I followed far enough to see where she'd gone downhill toward the drainage creek, the same direction as the old tunnel line. But when I reached the clearing beyond, she was gone. Not a sound, not a footprint in the frost. I didn't tell the sheriff right away. Maybe I should have. I sat on it for 2 days, hoping it was just exhaustion memory playing tricks. But on the 3rd morning, I found an envelope tucked under my office door. No return address, no markings, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, printed from an old negative. It showed the same clearing, the same carved tree. In the corner stood the girl I'd seen, and in the bottom right corner, a date, October 2nd, 2003. I called Sheriff Bauer the moment I saw it. She met me at the station an hour later, hair pulled back tight, her coat still dusted with the morning frost. I slid the photo across the desk. She studied it for a long while before looking up. "You said she looked about 12, 13, maybe," I said. "You think she's one of them?" She didn't have to clarify what she meant. One of the children from the photos we'd recovered. "Could be," I said. "But how does a kid from 2 decades ago walk out of a sealed site?" She didn't answer. None of us could. That afternoon, we took the photo to the Bureau office in Fresno. Agent Kellerman was there, same calm professionalism that somehow made everything feel heavier. She placed the picture under a magnifier and pointed to the edges. "This isn't a copy," she said. "This is original film. And look here, these markings. That's the same stock used in the old behavioral documentation reels we found." She turned off the lamp, leaned back in her chair. Whatever this place was, it didn't end when it was supposed to. The following week, a maintenance crew clearing brush near the northern service road reported finding more remains, 2 sets, shallow graves less than a mile from the original site. The soil had shifted after the summer rains, exposing bits of bone and fabric. I was called out to verify the location. It was remote colder up there, the air thinner, almost metallic. The sheriff and I stood over the dig site while the coroner worked. "Adult female, adult male," he said quietly, likely buried mid-90s. The second he said it, I knew. Anna and Mark. I watched as they lifted what was left of them from the dirt, each fragment wrapped in linen, each motion done with the kind of reverence you learn from doing this work too long. It didn't bring comfort, but there was something like peace in the certainty. After that, the story hit the news in pieces. Bunker mystery in the Sierras, uncovered project linked to missing hikers. You could hear it everywhere for a few weeks. Talk radio podcasts, those evening segments where they compress 30 years of tragedy into 2 clean minutes before cutting to commercials. Then the fire season came again, and the headlines moved on. But for those of us who'd seen it, it didn't move on. You can't unsee the way the walls of that place were carved, or how each mark in the concrete looked like a calendar someone never finished crossing off. Winter settled early. The Bureau pulled their field team in November, sealed the site permanently under federal order. The sheriff retired a month later. Tess transferred to another district. By Christmas, the office felt hollow. I boxed up the case files and stored them in the archives top shelf where sunlight never reached. But even then, I couldn't shake the hum. Some nights when the wind came down the mountain just right, you could hear it faintly through the ground, a vibration more felt than heard. And once, just once, I swore I saw light moving under the soil near where the hatch used to be. Faint, pulsing like a heartbeat under glass. The years went by. Reports stopped coming. The forest healed itself the way it always does, slowly, quietly pretending it never broke. They built a new visitor center down by the highway, and people started hiking the ridge again. But no one goes near that sector. The maps don't show it anymore. It's just a blank patch of green where Tree 9 used to stand. I still go up there every so often. Old habits die harder than fear. I walk the edge of the restricted zone and listen. The ground feels still most days. But sometimes when the air hangs just right and the forest goes completely silent, I catch a whisper, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. And every time I hear it, I remember the last words etched into that bark. Session continues here. A few weeks ago, another envelope showed up at my door. No name, no address. Inside, a single photograph, again, grainy gray, printed on film stock, decades out of use. It showed the same ridge, same slope, but this time the carving was gone. In its place was something new, deeper, cleaner. 2 words, root deeper. I keep the photo in my desk drawer under the old trail maps and the worn badge I turned in when I retired. I tell myself it's a hoax, a prank from someone who's read too much about the case online. But sometimes late at night I'll pull it out and study the corners, and I swear I can smell the forest, cold earth pine resin, the faint hum of something alive beneath it all. And I wonder, not for the first time, if some places were never meant to be reopened. Maybe they were meant to sleep and we just forgot how to leave them alone. Because the truth is, the forest never gave everything back. It never does. And if you stand on that ridge long enough, you'll understand what I mean. The wind there doesn't just move through the trees, it carries names, faint and unfinished, spoken in a language that isn't for us anymore. That's the sound I hear when the world goes quiet. The echo of something that started long before us. Still waiting, still listening, still running somewhere deep below the soil under a tree that refuses to die.